If you would, to Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8. And we'll get back into our study of the book of Mark together in that particular moment. As we've been walking through this book, and we've been examining the various miracles that Jesus was performing, and the various parables that he would teach, and the manner in which he would educate the audience. And you see him kind of in two different modes in some ways. You see how he interacts with the multitudes when there's lots of folks around, and the kinds of things that he wants to convey to larger audiences. When the audience seems to shrink, when it's his immediate disciples, or even at times, as we're going to see another case here in Mark chapter 8, where a miracle may be performed or something will occur, and Jesus, because he's very cognizant of the timing of events and how he wants and how his Father wants all things to unfold and be fulfilled in a particular time period, Jesus at times restrains those who know a little bit more about him or experience different things as it relates to him, and tries to compel them to keep that quiet for now. That's somewhat successful at times, not so successful at times, where some ignore his pleas and continue to present the things that he'd asked them to hold off on. And so we kind of pick up in a moment similar to that here in chapter 8. Notice he said, "In those days, the multitude being very great, and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples unto him, and saith unto them, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now been with me 3 days, and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away fasting to their own houses, they will faint by the way, for divers of them came from afar." Now, does this sound familiar? Yeah, it does sound a little familiar, right? Because just a few chapters ago, there was another scene very similar to it. If you recall, there was some folks that had followed Jesus into a deserted area where there weren't really any villages or places for them to go to try to find any kind of sustenance. And Jesus asks of them, well, what do you have? Well, how can we feed them? And he has that encounter with his disciples. I find it almost completely fascinating. Almost completely fascinating. Boy, that's a really profound statement, isn't it? It's a fascinating thing to consider that his disciples, even though they have already seen him feed thousands with little, are still what? Yeah, they're still not sure. They're still not sure, but they've already witnessed this once. But we're going to find here in a matter that they're still not sure about it. So he asked them about these folks, and he says, I can't, they've been fasting. In other words, they've been out there with him for 3 days. Nobody's done anything but stay there, apparently. And he says, it's time really for them to disperse, but I don't think they'll what? Yeah, Jesus says, I don't think they'll make it home. These folks haven't eaten for 3 days, and some of them live a pretty good distance, and if we don't feed them before they go, I don't think they're going to make it. And so he makes this statement to his disciples, and here comes the reaction in verse 4. And his disciples answered him, feed them like you did the other 5,000. No, that's completely wrong, isn't it? That's not in there at all. You would think that's what they would say, right? You would think that you would hear them say, well, you've already done this once. Can we do it that way again? But they go right back to the mindset they had prior to the first time he'd fed thousands. His disciples answered him, from whence can a man satisfy these men with bread here in the wilderness? How do you expect us to do that? That's the same statement they made the first time, right? How do you expect us to do that? He asked them, how many loaves have ye? And they said, 7. They're in luck. Why? Because that's 2 more than they had the last time, right? That's 2 more than they had the last time. They've got 7 loaves this time, and he commanded the people to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks and brake, and gave to his disciples to set before them, and they did set them before the people. And they had a few small fish, and he blessed and commanded to set them also before them. So think about this scene as a whole here for a moment. It's not all that dissimilar to what we saw the first time this occurred, where he feeds a lot of folks who've assembled in one location. It's curious, in some ways, you in my thought processes, his statements in verses 2 and 3, to me, are almost priming his disciples. How are they going to react to this? Will they remember those other miracles? Well, how are these disciples? I don't think that Jesus has any doubt in his mind what he's going to do. I don't know that Jesus has any reservations about what he's going to do. These questions aren't for his benefit. He's not inquiring to them so that he can help kind of sort and figure all this out. He inquires of these disciples for their benefit. And they're going to respond in the same way they did really the first time. And so he's going to show them, in some senses, one more time, how he has the power to feed thousands with little. So they're all sitting, and he sets the food before them. And verse 8, so they did eat, and were filled, and they took up of the broken meat that was left 7 baskets. Now, what's interesting about this? So 7 this time, 12 the time before. In fact, I think that's going to be dealt with before this chapter's over with. But this time still, maybe a little less, but still at the end of this process, we start with 7 loaves, some fish. We don't know few. We don't know exactly how many that might have been in this instance, at least according to Mark's record here. And yet all the multitude is filled. And there's still enough to gather up left when they're done. It's the same basic miracle over again in 2 different locations with 2 different, in some senses, potentially 2 different multitudes. Yeah. And let's look more because I think there's a piece of this that'll help us maybe get a little bit of insight of what Jesus thinks as it relates to them. And anyway, I'll hold the reins on that for a minute because I think we'll see another piece of this puzzle that'll kind of relate to that before we're done. And I'm not trying to be hypercritical of them. And it is interesting though that Jesus, I think he's drawing them. He's trying to see what kinds of answers they're going to give. And I think he finds it challenging that they revert to the old disciples, not the ones who have witnessed some things. I'm not saying they forgot in so much as they just haven't been empowered by it as much as they should have by this stage. But anyway, we'll see more of that before we're done. So he said in this instance, those that had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. And straightway he entered into a ship with his disciples and came into the parts of Dalmanutha, either way, say it however you want to. And the Pharisees came forth and began to question with him, seeking of him a sign from heaven, tempting him. So the scene switches for a moment. And as was somewhat customary, Jesus sends or enters into a boat, a ship, and he moves into a new location. Now, these Pharisees had come from where? We've seen a couple of times in the narrative. Jerusalem. Their origins, anyway, are connected into Jerusalem. And so we've kind of concluded that the word concerning Jesus, the things and events that Jesus had been accomplishing, had reached to an extent that it had gotten to Jerusalem. These Pharisees are now curious about this fellow who's influencing these Jewish villages and these Jewish areas up and around the Sea of Galilee. So here come these Pharisees, not for any goodwill whatsoever, but really with malintent. They've attempted different and various ways to question him thus far. You recall the asking of them, why do your disciples eat with unwashed hands, in that scene. And so now there's Pharisees here. And they come forth, and they basically seek of him a sign from heaven, and then the key phrase really is tempting him. And Jesus understands the purpose and nature. This is not about them trying to decide whether they really believe in him or not. This isn't any effort on their part to try to draw close to him or understand him. They're tempting him. They're trying him. How will he react to this? Will he give us a sign? What kind of sign will he give? Can we accuse him of anything once he's done that? And their motive is completely opposed to really the things that Jesus is trying to accomplish. And so how does Jesus react? Yeah, he says he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why doth this generation seek after a sign? Verily I say unto you, there shall no sign be given unto this generation." There's already been what? Many signs. There's already been plenty of signs. And they have chosen to ignore the things that have already occurred. And Jesus, understanding that, knows that he could show them how many signs? He could show them another dozen signs, and it won't change it. Because their interest isn't about thinking their interest in Jesus. Their mindset isn't about growing any kind of relationship with him. Their sole intent is to figure out some way we can accuse him of something and deal with him in that fashion. And so he says, "I'm not going to give you any sign. It's not going to come." Because of their motives and their efforts to tempt him. And his question, "Why doth this generation seek after a sign? Why are you looking for one when they've already been presented to you over and over again?" It's a dishonest approach. And so what I've appreciated about Jesus, and what you can appreciate about him as he walks through his life, and he deals particularly with the scribes and Pharisees, but how he doesn't give credit to dishonest people. He doesn't give them time to play their games and to make their traps and the things. He's very direct with folks who come to him with dishonest means. And when they come asking for a sign, he can see through that dishonesty because they'd already been plenty of signs offered. They weren't really interested in any evidence of who he was. And he just lets them go. He doesn't entertain them in that sense. So he left them, and entering into the ship, again departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, neither had they in the ship with them more than one loaf. The disciples and bread have real issues. They struggle with it. And this time, they have not taken any bread, except they can maybe find a loaf, the text says. And now that's a precursor to what's going to happen in the next conversation. He charged them, saying, "Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod." So he's just dealt with the Pharisees. They get back on a boat. They begin to travel. He makes this statement, and they reason among themselves, "It's because we have no bread." Not really, but they're still struggling. They still have tremendous uncertainties at times at the meanings and the significance of the things that Jesus says to them. And so we get moments like this where Jesus says, "Beware the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod," and their conclusion is he's concerned about the fact that we forgot to bring bread on the boat. And when Jesus knew it, he said unto them, "Why reason ye because you have no bread? Perceive ye not yet, neither understand? Have ye your heart yet hardened? Having eyes see not, and having ears hear ye not? And do you not remember when I brake the 5 loaves among 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up?" And what they say? 12. When the 7 among 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? And they said, 7. He says to them, "How is it that you do not understand. And Bob, that's what I was talking about earlier when I said I think this conversation sets the stage for what was happening back there when he fed the second group. Because to me, he's pretty blunt when he says, "Perceive? Don't you perceive yet? Don't you understand yet? Is your heart still hardened? Aren't you seeing with your eyes? Aren't you listening with your ears? Don't you hear the things I'm sharing with you? Is your memory bad? Do you not remember?" And then he asked the two questions about how much was taken up. And then that final statement in verse 21, then if you've seen all this, if you've been witness to all these things, how is it that you're still not understanding the things that I'm saying? When I said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod, I'm not talking about bread. You've already seen those things. You've already seen and witnessed the power I've demonstrated. And for some reason, you're rejecting it. You haven't let it, and I don't mean reject it as in wholesale or denying it. I mean they're rejecting the benefit it's supposed to bring and the understanding it's supposed to lead them to. They're still not perceiving it as Jesus would hope they would. They're still not understanding it like Jesus would suppose they would. And he's baffled and he's frustrated. That's a better word maybe. He's frustrated with the fact that they're still struggling, coming to very basic understandings of some very simple principles. What's leaven do? Yeah, a little leaven does. Yeah, it ferments and it affects everything. When he says beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, what's he talking about? Yeah, beware of them, right? And don't let them leaven you. Don't let their mindset and their attitudes and don't let the thoughts of Herod and his group, which I think in some ways, now tie that a little bit, because where have we seen him in Mark's account? When did Mark talk about Herod? As it related to whom? It was related to John the Baptist, right? And he gave that lengthy discourse about what had happened to John the Baptist at the hands of Herod and Herod's wife that he shouldn't have had and all that situation. And so I don't think it's coincidental here then that Mark records for us now this statement of Jesus, where Jesus basically says there are two entities that are going to try to leaven the work and things that I'm trying to accomplish. You have the Pharisaical element, right? The Jews and their leadership. They're going to try to affect the work and things that we're trying to do. And you've got the government side. And they're going to try to affect the things that we're doing. You need to be aware of both of them. You're going to be challenged when you further this cause and when you continue to promote the message of Jesus. You're going to be challenged with both those who are of the leadership among the Jews and the leadership within the government. And those really are the two leading entities in the region. This is going to be hard. You're going to have to be able to overcome the efforts they put forth to mar and challenge the work we're doing. And then you understand why it's frustrating to Jesus that he's repeating himself. Because they really should have reached a stage, his immediate disciples should have already hit a stage where these things are starting to click. And it's challenging to Jesus when he's having to say, why do you not perceive? Why are you not seeing? Why are you not hearing? Have you not seen enough signs? Didn't I feed 5,000 and there were 12 left over? And did I not feed 4,000 and there were 7 left over? And he reminds them of those things. Thoughts or questions of that stage? Because he's rapid fire in chapter 8. One spot to the next spot to the next spot to the next spot.
What they're doubting is why they think that Jesus said this about leaven because they only had one loaf of bread. And yet he's trying to make a metaphor with them that it's not the bread he's talking about the corruption
I,
Why they persisted, like they didn't know.
yeah. And I'm just basing that on what Jesus said right there. He basically said, "And do you not remember?" They're not remembering as accurately and with purpose as, not that they forgot 5,000 were fed or 4,000 were fed. They're forgetting the meaning of that, and they're forgetting the purpose of it. Yeah. Anyway, I give you my 2 cents. All right. So he moves on to Bethsaida, and they run into various moments here. It's going to get blurry if I go too big. But we're so back up here around the Sea of Galilee, Bethsaida. Some reason it won't let me have a pen, but it's in the green, the dark green towards the top. You can see the wee little dot I'm showing you on the little black dot, but right at the top of the Sea of Galilee is Bethsaida. That's where they've headed. And so they've been then traversing. Here's that Dalmanutha is on the other side. You recall that? So they're on in one area. He performs. They feeds in the wilderness. They feed the 4,000. They travel over to Dalmanutha. It's a frustrating moment there with the Pharisees. Now they go back across the sea towards the north, and now they're up here at the top at Bethsaida. As they encounter this circumstance with the blind man. So he comes to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes, and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. In other words, so now don't. There's 2 different instances similar like this, right? There's one where he spits on the ground, makes the clay, applies it on the eye, sends the man to the pool of Siloam, and he comes back. Different scene. This time, it just says he spit on his eyes. That's what it says. It's unusual. It's unorthodox, but if the result is what I'm looking for, I suppose I'll live with what seems to be unorthodoxy leading into this. So he had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, and he asked him if he could see. And he looked up and said, I see men as trees walking. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but to me, that probably implies that this is not a man who was blind from birth. And the reason I say that is because he was able to draw an analogy. If he had never seen a tree, I don't suppose he would have been able, if he had been blind from birth and had never seen a man walking or a tree, I don't know that he's able to make this analogy. And I don't know that that's necessarily significant. I just thought of it as I was reading through it, that it's interesting that he was able, when he first begins to see, his description is that it looks like men as trees walking. In other words, he's not seeing clearly. He's not seeing clearly. So after that, he put his hands again upon his eyes and made him look up, and he was restored and saw every man clearly. Now the challenge. Have we seen any scene like this yet? Where, for lack of a better description, it took 2 tries or 2 doses of power, if you will, to help somebody who was in need. To my knowledge, this is the first time we've encountered anything like this. Where Jesus, in some senses, and I don't want to say he failed, but the job was not completed in its first effort. It was completed in its second effort. And it may very well be, to my knowledge, the first time, at least in Mark's account, and maybe the first time within the chronology, where we see something like that. And it does at least draw the question, why? Why is it that somehow Jesus' initial effort with this man didn't produce clarity in his eyesight? That it took two different moments. I'll give you your chance first. Go ahead, Ed.
They said they brought the blind man to him.
Yeah.
Maybe this blind man wasn't ready to be healed, or maybe he didn't believe anything. Maybe his friend said, "Come along, and Jesus is going to take care of you out down there." And finally, they talked him into going. So why he took different steps was to increase this man's faith.
Okay. And that's a possibility within the idea that you may have a man who may not have made, I don't know that he's against his will, but he may not have made his own, it wasn't his own choice necessarily. There could be some of that implication where they just come and say, "Hey, there's a guy over here that can probably make you see, come on." And they take him, and it takes twice the effort in a sense because of that. I think that's the right direction, but maybe just a half a step in a different direction.
I'm not sure about this, but did this town, was there some kind of that Jesus wouldn't heal or wouldn't allow things to happen in that town, and that's why Jesus took him by the hand and took him out of the town? Was it just something that, am I thinking of a different city that
Yeah, I'd have to go back and I don't know that there's a. Yeah, I don't. He spoke of that in his own home in Nazareth. He said he did not do many signs there because they were unbelieving. That's to me the only place I recall. My conclusion as to why he left this town was because he didn't want an audience. Notice verse 26. He sent him away to his house, saying, "Don't go into the town, nor tell it to any in the town." I think this is again one of those miracles that Jesus doesn't want broadcast yet, and so he wants to limit the number of people. If he does it in the middle of town square, lots of people are going to see it and know. I'd have to go back and check, Mary, on the other question, the other half of your question, as to whether Jesus had any encounter in Bethsaida where he said he wouldn't perform miracles in that particular city anymore. I'd have to look that up. Well, and I think not just to the disciples, but maybe in a general way. And I think that's maybe part of the picture here. From a spiritual sense, to take somebody, well, it's spiritual truth. That's right. If we could do this, if in this building it'd be easy to do it in some ways because there's no windows in it. But if I went back there real quick and I flipped all the lights out and we turned it dark in here, which I won't do because it'll just frustrate you. But if we went back there and flipped all the lights out, and I gave your eyes just 30 seconds or so to kind of adjust to the darkness, and then in an instant I flipped all the lights back on, how well are you going to see in that first instant? Yeah, you're not going to see very well, right? Even though we went from darkness to light, sometimes when you go from utter darkness to utter light, the clarity's not there immediately. What are we when we live our sinful selves, which is in darkness, and we begin to expose our dark selves into the light of the gospel? We don't always see it clearly. And sometimes it takes a second, third, sometimes it takes a process of time. I believe it's a tremendous metaphor for how people come to Jesus. Not everybody comes to Jesus in a dead sprint and sees everything as clearly as everybody else in the same moment in time. I think sometimes we've created maybe a scenario in our minds where people come to Jesus by steps. And I'm not saying we were wrong in talking about the steps of salvation or the plan of salvation. That's not what I'm implying. But we might have oversold it from this perspective that you do this step, then you do this step, then you do this step, and you're there. Where that may not necessarily, people may take this step, and then they may have to take 2 more steps, and they may have to take 2 little steps, and everybody's going to get there at a different pace. Not everybody's going to see everything as clearly in the same moments. And this fellow, to me, is a perfect metaphor for what's really going to be accomplished in the gospel. Some people are going to see more clearly, more quickly. For lack of a better description, maybe the world that they were living in wasn't quite as dark. Maybe the challenges in their lives and the things in their lives and the things they were involved in aren't as difficult as other things are to leave. And so the light exposes them in a different way. If I've lived in pitch blackness for a long time and I'm immediately exposed to the light, it may take me some time to try to draw some clarity of that. And so in many ways, to me, it's just a picture. This is a perfect metaphor that when you come to Jesus, it takes people more than one step sometimes to get there. And it requires patience. You're okay, Pam. Go ahead. Yeah. When you see that description, look up. You can kind of see that spiritual connection to the picture as well.
Somebody that's been raised in a denominational church starts coming to the Church of Christ, their baby wants to take them longer to get there because they have to get rid of what they've already done. There's somebody that's making it here, making it testimony. It took me a long time to be able to say that my grandparents or whoever.
And that's a different topic in some ways altogether. But what I appreciate about what you're saying, Marlene, is and what that teaches us then is we need to be a more patient people. This is teaching me we need. If Jesus, you think about it, did Jesus apply the spittle, touch him, and ask him, "What do you see?" And the man says, "Well, it looks like men are trees walking around." And Jesus didn't say, "I can't believe you didn't get that. I can't believe you don't see well enough." That's not his reaction at all. Jesus then comes back and touches him again. And that's the level of patience we need as well. Everyone's going to come with various things that we have to work. The truth is, Marlene, all of us do. You know what I mean? In some ways, all of us have things that we've been kind of biased towards, and we might find out that we didn't really see something as clearly as we should have, and we're enlightened as we study Scripture. And so it is an interesting picture, a metaphor of those kinds of things. Yeah, and that was what Mary was referencing out of Matthew 11 a little bit ago. And it could be. It's hard sometimes to know in some ways because he did choose to go back. You know what I mean? And so you wonder a little bit in relationship to some of that as to timing. And I'm trying to just make sure. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah, and again, I mean, we could speculate all day about the man's condition and that kind of thing, and I'm Because there are too many miracles within Scripture where some people came with tremendous faith and they were healed. Other people didn't have any, and they received benefit. And so it's not always related to a person's faith. In this particular case, it may educate us in relationship to those things. But I'm careful not to unless Jesus specifically says it. Sometimes he does. Sometimes he says, well, you had great faith, or this man didn't. And it's more... Yeah. And so anyway, that seems to be the case here. I'm just trying to make sure while I'm looking at my timeline sheet real quick is just to make sure. Because you're dealing with, because I think this account's revisited in Matthew 16. So 2 different moments in Bethsaida. So Jesus went back. Even though he may have been frustrated the first go-around, Matthew chapter 11, he chooses to go back into that region. And so there's various reasons. I don't see this, but I don't see a lot of difference between this moment here in verse 26 than what we've seen time and time again, where he tells the guy, don't go back home, go down into Decapolis and tell people down that Greek region, don't go into the Jewish communities and tell them. So it's not an unusual thing for that to happen here. Well, Nat, we talked about that a little bit, but I think that if he's able to make that analogy, he's probably, it's likely he has seen something before. Yep. Yeah, and Ed was hinting at that too. He isn't necessarily the one choosing. He's one somebody comes and says you oughta. Yeah, it's an educational matter. Yeah. Okay, so Jesus then goes out with his disciples into the towns of Caesarea Philippi. And by the way, he asked his disciples, saying unto them, whom do men say that I am? And so, powerful question. And Jesus is curious as to the disciples, what their take is on what they've been hearing. Now, we know people have been talking because who already kind of said something similar to what the initial answer is going to be? Herod did, right? When Herod had heard about Jesus, he's convinced that it was John the Baptist brought back to life. And then Mark records for us why John's dead, at Herod's hands. But Herod is scared to death because he's convinced that this Jesus that's going around, he's got to be John. That he just has to be John. And others said, no, maybe he's Elias or one of the other prophets. Maybe he's one of the. And so this idea of Jesus being a reincarnation or a rebirth or resurrection of one of these Old Testament characters as something that lots of people have been talking about. Different folks have been conversing about what they think or who they think he might be. And so their initial response is accurate, by the way, because he asked them that. Whom do men say? What are you hearing people say about me? So they answered, John the Baptist, but some say Elias, and others, one of the prophets. Some are determined you're John the Baptist. Some are even more determined that maybe you're Elijah. And others, or Isaiah, and others are just saying, well, he's got to just be one of the prophets. And then the real question, whom do you say that I am? He says, what do you say? What conclusion have you made? You've heard all what men have said about me. You've heard all these ideas that could be possibilities about who I am. Whom do you say that I am? And Peter answered and said to them, but thou art, and Peter answered and saith unto him, Thou art the Christ. Through all the doubts, challenges, lessons about bread, trying to encourage them to be more perceptive, more understanding, more appreciative of the things that he was accomplishing. Through all of it, there is one significant point that at least Peter has gotten. You're the Messiah. You're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. We may not understand all the details about what you're up to and what you're trying to teach us and how you're trying to teach us and all those various things. We may not grasp all that, but we are convinced of who you are. You're the Christ, the Son of God. But interesting, what's his reaction to that in verse 30? Yeah, you're right, but it's not time to tell anybody that yet. And I still think that gets back to the timing of events. Jesus understands that certain things need to unfold that require from the human side time. One of which is to get these disciples ready for it. They're not ready for him to die yet. But if he goes and openly starts declaring that he's the Christ, he speeds up the timetable in which they're going to put him to death. And so he's cautious in certain moments. Eventually he'll begin to be more bold, and again, eventually more things will be said. But at this stage, he's cautious. This is not the time yet for that message, especially knowing what's going to come. We might wonder, well, why? But Jesus understands in greater senses than we would or they did about the timetable that needed to take place and the things that people need to be prepared for before that.
There was one time that people got around and tried to make him king.
Yeah, and so
He said, what's my time?
right, and so there's. Go ahead, Jim. I'm sorry. Yeah, and there's a level of time that has to take place. So he begins to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he spake that, saying openly. So the idea to me of that is that Jesus, without reservation, begins to already prep his disciples that this process that we're on here, this path that we're on, may not be as pleasant as you think. You may right now be somewhat emboldened by the multitudes. That everywhere he goes, there's a multitude. Every place that Jesus arrives, people are seeking him out. There's a level of popularity that is deceiving, potentially, to these disciples. And so he's starting to tell them very early on here, I'm going to have to suffer many things. And I'm going to be rejected of the elders. In other words, the who? Who are the elders? Leadership of the Jews. You're assuming, right? They're assuming that they've got the Messiah, the Christ, on their hands, and in their minds he's supposed to become the king over Israel. And their minds simply think, we just need enough time to convince everybody that that's who he is, and this will work. And then Jesus turns around and says, number one, I'm going to suffer a lot of things. And number two, the leadership's not going to accept me. The elders, the leadership among the Jews are not going to, the chief priests and the scribes, I'm going to suffer many things and be rejected at their hands, and ultimately I'm going to die and be killed and rise again the third day.
Peter used the title Christ is carrying more weight than what he many times is the Son of Man.
When I see the term Son of Man, my mind generally, and I'm not saying it's this way 100%, but my mind generally goes that he's referencing something to the humanity side of himself. In what fashion is he going to suffer as the Christ? If you're thinking of it that way, as divinity, no, you can't do anything to God. You can't do anything to deity. But the Son of Man, yeah, he can suffer many things, and to me those moments are generally just used not just to simply emphasize that he's dual. He is God, but God made manifest in the flesh, man. And the Son of Man, the humanity side of him, is going to experience these things. Yeah. So I would agree with that subtle difference, if you will, or that emphasis difference in why you see him refer to himself as the Son of Man from time to time. So he'll be put to death, and after 3 days, rise again. And he said this openly, and Peter took him and began to what? Now, isn't that fascinating? The man who just was seemingly 2 breaths ago said, "Thou art the Christ," but that same fella has the audacity, for lack of a better term, to try to take Jesus and pull him aside and say, "No. Wait a minute. These things can't happen. You can't go through these kinds of things. You can't suffer these things."
He's still looking at it as an earthly
Yeah.
kingdom.
And he can't get past that. So when he had turned about and looked on his disciples, he rebukes Peter, saying, "Get thee behind me, Satan, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men." And that hints towards that concept, Jim, that Peter doesn't want him to suffer and die because he's still thinking earthly throne. And from the what this helps in some ways for me to appreciate, even at the death and the burial, even in some senses at the resurrection moment, his disciples are still challenged by this concept of wanting an earthly king and how all that's going to occur. And it's not unusual in a sense that that's happening at the end of this process, because they set that stage at the very beginning. That Peter is already setting the stage for that mindset of this can't happen this way. And Jesus saying, "Get behind me, Satan. This is the path, and this is the path I'm taking." And Satan's the only one that wants to stop that path. And so if you want to try to, then that's the metaphor, the picture that you become. There's things of God that need to take place. And Satan's the only one standing between me and those accomplishments. And Peter, you need to step aside and let me fulfill these things.
Everybody's going to say it, they have to be Peter.
Yeah.
So he's getting in trouble.
Okay, Lord willing, we'll come back in Sunday morning and finish this chapter out. And then look at those questions for it and then move on a little bit into chapter 9.